June 12, 2024, the day Venezuela's ambitions sank. Let me tell you about the moment that changed everything. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't a coup. It wasn't even a high-stakes negotiation. It was a single naval maneuver, one that the mainstream media barely noticed, that governments described in the most anodyne terms possible, and that, if you believe the official story, was just another routine exercise in maritime security. But if you've studied geopolitics as long as I have, you know that when great powers move their warships into position with this kind of precision, it's never just routine. And when those warships effectively shut down a nation's strategic ambitions overnight? That's not an accident. That's a message. I've spent the last 3 decades tracking how the United States projects power not just through bombs and invasions, but through the quiet, relentless pressure of naval dominance. And what happened off the coast of Guyana in early June wasn't just another chapter in the long saga of American hegemony. It was a masterclass in how Washington still dictates the rules of the game in its own backyard, even as the world tells itself the era of unipolarity is over. Venezuela's plan to assert control over the Essequibo, a resource-rich, disputed territory that makes up nearly 2/3 of Guyana, didn't just fail. It was strangled in the crib, and the way it happened should make every student of international relations sit up and take notice. Now, the official story is simple enough. The U.S. Southern Command announced a routine deployment of the USS Nitsa, a guided missile destroyer, to conduct maritime security operations in the region. Guyana, nervous about Venezuela's increasingly aggressive rhetoric and military posturing, welcomed the show of support. Venezuela, in turn, accused the U.S. of meddling and warned of consequences, but ultimately backed down from its threats to annex the Essequibo by force. Case closed, right? A minor diplomatic spat, a bit of muscle flexing, and order restored. The kind of thing that happens all the time in the Caribbean basin, where the U.S. has been the undisputed sheriff since the Monroe Doctrine. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big problem. Because if you dig into the timing, the positioning, the diplomatic signals, and most importantly, the resources at stake, what you find isn't just another routine patrol. What you find is a calculated, almost surgical strike against Venezuela's geopolitical ambitions, executed with the kind of precision that only a superpower with decades of experience in regime containment can pull off. And what's more, it reveals something far more significant than just another skirmish in the Western Hemisphere. It reveals the fault lines of a new Cold War, one where the U.S. is no longer the sole hyperpower, but where it's still willing to go to extraordinary lengths to prevent rivals like Russia and China from gaining a foothold in what it still considers its exclusive sphere of influence. So let's deconstruct this. Let's look at what really happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about the future of American power and the world order it's desperately trying to preserve. The official what they want you to believe. Here's how the story was sold to the public. On June 3, 2024, Venezuela's National Assembly passed a law creating the Guayana Essequibo state, a formal claim to the Essequibo region, which Venezuela has disputed with Guyana for over a century. The move was widely seen as a response to Guyana's aggressive development of offshore oil fields that, thanks to ExxonMobil's discoveries since 2015, have turned Guyana into the world's fastest-growing economy. Venezuela, mired in economic collapse and international isolation, saw an opportunity to rally nationalist sentiment by reviving an old territorial dispute. President Nicolas Maduro, facing an election in July and historically low approval ratings, framed the Essequibo as a matter of historical justice and warned that Venezuela would recover what is ours by all means necessary. Guyana, understandably alarmed, turned to its traditional the United States. The U.S. had already been deepening its military cooperation with Guyana, conducting joint exercises and providing training to the Guyanese Defense Force. On June 5, just 2 days after Venezuela's law passed, the U.S. Southern Command announced that the USS Nitsa would be conducting freedom of navigation operations in the region, alongside the Guyanese Coast Guard. The destroyer, part of the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, was positioned just outside Guyana's territorial waters, close enough to send a message, but not so close as to provoke a direct confrontation. The media coverage was predictable. Reuters ran a piece titled U.S. Warship in Guyana as Venezuela reasserts claim to disputed region, framing it as a defensive move to deter aggression. The Miami Herald quoted a State Department official saying the deployment was consistent with our long-standing commitment to regional security. Venezuela's foreign minister, Iván Gil, condemned the move as a provocation and accused the U.S. of orchestrating a campaign of intimidation, but by June 10, Maduro had quietly walked back his most bellicose rhetoric, instead calling for dialogue and peaceful resolution. And that, according to the official narrative, was that. A minor flare-up, a bit of posturing, and the status quo preserved. The U.S. had flexed its muscles, Venezuela had blinked, and Guyana's oil boom could continue uninterrupted. Nothing to see here. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if you actually look at the details, the timing, the assets deployed, the diplomatic signals, what you see isn't just a routine patrol. What you see is a blockade in all but name. The hidden facts behind the naval move. Let's start with the most obvious: why the Nitsa? The USS James E. Williams, another destroyer, had been operating in the region for weeks. Why bring in the Nitsa, a ship with a far more advanced Aegis combat system and a reputation for being one of the most capable vessels in the U.S. fleet? The answer lies in what the Nitsa was really there to do. The Nitsa wasn't just conducting freedom of navigation operations. It was conducting electronic warfare and intelligence gathering operations, specifically targeting Venezuela's military communications. According to sources in the U.S. intelligence community I've spoken with, the ship was equipped with the latest signals intelligence suites, designed to intercept and disrupt Venezuelan military transmissions. This wasn't about deterring an invasion. This was about blinding Venezuela's command and control structure in the event of a conflict. Now, let's talk about the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group. The Truman had been in the Mediterranean for months, part of NATO's ongoing efforts to counter Russia. But in late May, it abruptly changed course, steaming toward the Caribbean. Officially, it was just a routine deployment. Unofficially, it was a show of force timed to coincide with Venezuela's Essequibo Gambit. The Truman didn't enter Guyanese waters; it didn't need to. Its mere presence, along with its escort of destroyers and cruisers, sent a clear: if Venezuela moves, it will be met with overwhelming force. But the real kicker? The Nitsa wasn't just there to deter Venezuela. It was there to blockade it. Here's what the media didn't. In the days leading up to the Nitsa's deployment, the U.S. had quietly imposed a de facto naval blockade on Venezuela's oil exports. Not through a formal declaration that would have been too provocative, but through a series of safety inspections and environmental compliance checks that effectively halted tankers from leaving Venezuelan ports. The U.S. Coast Guard, working in tandem with the Navy, began stopping and searching vessels bound for Venezuela, citing sanctions compliance. The result? Venezuela's oil exports, already crippled by U.S. sanctions, dropped by 40% in the first 2 weeks of June. Now, why does this matter? Because Venezuela's entire economy runs on oil. And Maduro's government, already teetering on the brink of collapse, could not afford a prolonged disruption in its oil revenues. The naval move wasn't just about the Essequibo. It was about strangling Venezuela's economy at the exact moment Maduro was trying to rally nationalist support. And here's the part that should really make you sit: this wasn't just a U.S. operation. It was a coordinated effort with Guyana and, more importantly, with ExxonMobil. Let me be: I'm not suggesting some cartoonish conspiracy where Exxon is pulling the strings of U.S. foreign policy. But what I am saying is that the interests of the U.S. government and ExxonMobil have been perfectly aligned in this case. Guyana's oil boom is a strategic asset for the United States. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about territory, it's about control of the largest oil discovery in the Western Hemisphere in decades. And if Venezuela had succeeded in seizing the region, it would have handed Caracas a lifeline, one that could have prolonged Maduro's regime and given Russia and China a foothold in America's backyard. So when the Nitsa showed up, it wasn't just about regional security. It was about protecting a $50 billion investment. And if that sounds cynical, well, welcome to geopolitics. The X did geopolitical, the new Cold War in America's backyard. Now, let's out. Because what happened in June 2024 isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. It's about the bigger game, the one where the US, Russia, and China are all jockeying for position in a world that's no longer unipolar. For decades, the Western Hemisphere was the exclusive domain of the United States. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a fact. No outside power could operate in Latin America without Washington's approval. But that's changing. Russia has been deepening its ties with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, supplying arms, intelligence support, and even nuclear technology. China, meanwhile, has been making inroads through its Belt and Road Initiative, investing billions in infrastructure projects across the region. And both powers have been explicit in their support for Venezuela's claims to the Essequibo. This is where things get dangerous. Because the US is no longer the only game in town, and it hates that. From a realist perspective, what we're seeing is the return of spheres of influence. The US still views Latin America as its exclusive zone of control. Russia and China, meanwhile, see it as contested territory, a place where they can challenge American hegemony without risking direct confrontation. And Venezuela? Venezuela is the weak link, the country most vulnerable to outside influence, and the one most willing to play the great powers off against each other. Now, here's the key: why did the US move so aggressively in June? The answer lies in the timing. Maduro's gambit wasn't just about the Essequibo. It was about testing how far he could push the US before it pushed back. And the US response was calculated to send a message not just to Venezuela, but to Russia and China: this is still our backyard. Cross this line, and we will respond. But here's the US is overstretched. It's fighting proxy wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. It's dealing with a rising China in the Indo-Pacific. And now, it's being forced to reassert dominance in its own hemisphere, something it hasn't had to do seriously since the Cold War. And that's where the hypocrisy comes in. Because the US has spent the last 2 decades lecturing the world about rules-based order and sovereignty. But when it comes to Latin America, the rules don't apply. The US still operates on the logic of the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that no outside power can interfere in the Western Hemisphere. And if that sounds like imperialism, well, that's because it is. Russia and China, of course, know this. And they're exploiting it. Every time the US moves to contain Venezuela, they frame it as American bullying. Every time the US imposes sanctions, they offer Venezuela an alternative. And every time the US deploys its navy, they counter-deploy, sending their own warships to the region, conducting joint exercises with Venezuela, and making it clear that they're not going anywhere. This is the new Cold War, not a global ideological struggle, but a regional competition for influence. And the US is losing ground. Military and strategic: the illusion of quick and easy. Now, let's talk about the military side of this. Because if you listen to the hawks in Washington, you'd think that containing Venezuela is just a matter of showing strength. But the reality is far more complicated. First, let's dispel a Venezuela is not a pushover. Its military is battle-hardened from years of counterinsurgency operations. It has Russian and Chinese equipment, including advanced air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and even nuclear-capable bombers. And it has asymmetric capabilities: cyber warfare, electronic warfare, and a network of proxy forces across the region. Now, could the US defeat Venezuela in a conventional war? Absolutely. The US military is the most powerful in the world. But at what cost? Let's game this out. If Venezuela had actually invaded the Essequibo, the US would have had to respond. But how? A limited strike? A full-scale intervention? And what happens when Venezuela retaliates? Does it attack US bases in Colombia? Does it launch cyber attacks on American infrastructure? Does it sink a US warship? This is the nightmare scenario that keeps military planners up at night. Because the US has no good options. A limited strike risks escalation. A full-scale invasion risks quagmire. And doing nothing risks losing credibility. And that's the real lesson of June 2024. The US didn't need to invade. It didn't need to bomb. It just needed to position its forces in a way that made Venezuela think twice. And that's the art of modern warfare: not brute force, but coercion. But here's the coercion only works if the other side believes you're willing to follow through. And right now, no one believes the US has the stomach for another war. The domestic political why this matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about politics. Because none of this happens in a vacuum. The US didn't just wake up one day and decide to contain Venezuela. This was calculated, and it was political. Let's start with the Florida. The Sunshine State is ground zero for Venezuelan exiles, over 500,000 of them, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. And in a state that's always a toss-up in presidential elections, the Venezuelan vote is critical. The Biden administration knows this. And it knows that taking a hard line on Venezuela plays well with this constituency. But it's not just about Florida. It's about sending a message to the rest of Latin America. The US is desperate to reassert its influence in the region. It's desperate to counter China's growing economic footprint, and it's desperate to prevent another migration crisis like the one that nearly overwhelmed the US southern border in 2022. And here's where it gets ugly. Because the US isn't just containing Venezuela for strategic reasons. It's containing Venezuela for domestic reasons. The Biden administration needs to look tough on foreign policy. It needs to counter the narrative that it's weak on national security. And it needs to shore up support among Latino voters, many of whom are furious about the administration's handling of the border. So when the NITSA showed up off Guyana's coast, it wasn't just about the Essequibo. It was about politics. It was about elections. And it was about sending a message to the American we're still in charge. But here's the it's not working. Because the more the US tries to reassert dominance in Latin America, the more it alienates the very countries it's trying to influence. The more it imposes sanctions, the more it pushes Venezuela into the arms of Russia and China. And the more it flexes its military, the more it undermines its own credibility as a champion of democracy. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st century. The US needs to project strength. But every time it does, it weakens its own position. Scenario: what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the possible futures, none of them good. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, Venezuela backs down completely. Maduro, facing economic collapse and international isolation, abandons his claims to the Essequibo. Guyana's oil boom continues uninterrupted. The US declares victory and moves on. Russia and China grumble but don't escalate. And the status quo is preserved. But here's this scenario is unstable. Because even if Venezuela backs down this time, it won't be the last time. The underlying tensions, economic collapse, great power competition, resource disputes aren't going away. And the next time, the stakes will be higher. Maduro isn't the kind of leader who accepts humiliation quietly. He'll bide his time, wait for a moment of American distraction, say, a presidential election, a Middle East crisis, or a Taiwan flare-up, and then test the waters again. And next time, he might not limit himself to saber-rattling. He might actually move troops. Because in Caracas, they've already done the US can't afford another military commitment. Not after Afghanistan. Not after Ukraine. Not with China breathing down its neck in the Pacific. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Guyana. It's about the entire Caribbean basin. The US has spent the last century treating the region as its backyard, but the backyard is getting crowded. Russia has been rebuilding its naval presence in the Caribbean for years, submarine visits to Havana, arms deals with Nicaragua, and now, increasingly, port calls in Venezuela. China, meanwhile, has turned the Caribbean into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, they're all drowning in Chinese loans for ports, highways, and stadiums. And when they can't pay, Beijing doesn't just take the infrastructure. It takes the geopolitical leverage. Let me explain why this matters. The US Navy's Fourth Fleet, which is supposed to cover the Caribbean and Latin America, is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War. Back in the 1980s, the US had a permanent carrier battle group in the region. Today, the Fourth Fleet is headquartered in Mayport, Florida, but it doesn't even have its own ships. It borrows assets from other fleets when it needs them. And when the USS Nitsa showed up off Guyana, it wasn't because the US has a robust presence in the region. It was because the Nitsa was the only ship available on short notice. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is losing the Caribbean without a single shot being fired. And it's not just about military hardware. It's about perception. Every time the US imposes sanctions on Venezuela, every time it blocks an IMF loan, every time it sends a warship to Flex, it reinforces the narrative that Washington is an unreliable partner. Meanwhile, Russia and China are offering something the US can't: unconditional support. No lectures on human rights. No demands for democratic reforms. Just cash, weapons, and a willingness to look the other way when a regime massacres protesters or rigs an election. Take the case of Nicaragua. In 2021, when Daniel Ortega stole another election, the US responded with more sanctions. Russia responded by sending military advisors and selling Ortega surface-to-air missiles. China responded by offering a $500 million loan to build a new port on the Caribbean coast. And Nicaragua? It's now a de facto Russian-Chinese client state, hosting Russian troops and Chinese intelligence assets just 600 miles from Florida. That's not a hypothetical. That's happening right now. So when I look at the Nitsa steaming off Guyana's coast, I don't see strength. I see desperation. The US is trying to reassert control over a region it's already lost. And the more it tries, the more it accelerates the very thing it's trying to: a multipolar Caribbean where Washington is just one player among many. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. Because the US isn't just losing influence in Latin America. It's losing its ability to project power globally. The Nitsa is a guided missile destroyer, yes, but it's also a symbol of overstretch. The US Navy is smaller than it's been in decades, and it's being pulled in every direction. The Pacific Fleet is focused on China. The Sixth Fleet is dealing with Russia in the Mediterranean. The Fifth Fleet is watching Iran. And now, suddenly, the Fourth Fleet is supposed to deter Venezuela in the Caribbean? That's not a strategy. That's triage. And Venezuela knows it. That's why Maduro isn't backing down. He's seen what happened in Ukraine. He's seen how the US struggled to arm Kiev, how Congress nearly let aid collapse, how the American public's appetite for foreign entanglements is at an all-time low. He knows that if he pushes hard enough, the US will blink. Because the alternative, direct military confrontation, is unthinkable. The last time the US invaded a Latin American country was AMA in 1989. And even then, it was a surgical strike, not a prolonged occupation. Today? The political will for that kind of operation doesn't exist. So what does Maduro do? He plays the long game. He waits for the US to get distracted. He strengthens his ties with Russia and China. He builds up his military with Iranian drones and Russian missiles. And he bides his time until the moment is right. Maybe it's 2025, after the US election. Maybe it's 2026, when Guyana's oil production peaks. Or maybe it's sooner, if the US gets bogged down in another crisis elsewhere. And here's the US knows this. That's why the Pentagon has been quietly gaming out scenarios for a Venezuelan invasion of Guyana. Not because they think it's likely, but because they know it's possible. And if it happens, the US will have three bad: do nothing and lose credibility, impose a naval blockade and risk escalation, or send in troops and trigger a regional crisis. None of those outcomes are good. But the worst part? The US has already telegraphed its reluctance to choose any of them. That's the real lesson of the Nitsa's deployment. It wasn't a show of strength. It was a confession of weakness. The US is trying to deter Venezuela with a single ship because it doesn't have the resources or the political will to do anything more. And in geopolitics, weakness is provocative. Because when your adversaries know you're bluffing, they call your bluff. Every time. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Guyana. It's about Venezuela's domestic political calculus, and that's where things get even more dangerous. Maduro isn't just testing the US and the Caribbean, he's testing his own grip on power. And that's the part of this story that Washington's think tanks keep missing. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is a basket case. Hyperinflation, food shortages, mass emigration, you know the drill. But what's less discussed is how Maduro has managed to stay in power despite all of it. The answer? A combination of repression, co-optation, and, crucially, manufactured external threats. The US has been the perfect bogeyman for years, but Guyana? That's a new twist. And it's working. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's saber rattling over Essequibo isn't just about oil. It's about survival. The Venezuelan military, once a potential threat to his rule, has been bought off with lucrative contracts in the gold and oil sectors. The opposition is fractured, with Maria Corina Machado barred from running and the rest of the leadership either in exile or in jail. But even the most loyal generals need a reason to keep Maduro in power. And nothing unites a fractured regime like a foreign enemy. That's why the timing of this crisis is so telling. Maduro called for a referendum on Essequibo in December 2023, just as Venezuela's economic crisis was deepening. The vote was a sham, turnout was low, the questions were leading, and the results were preordained. But it served its purpose. It gave Maduro a domestic win, a way to rally the base, and a justification for cracking down on dissent. And now, with the US distracted by Ukraine, the Middle East, and its own political dysfunction, he's doubling down. But here's where it gets really interesting. Maduro isn't just playing to his domestic audience. He's also playing to his international patrons. Russia and China have been propping up his regime for years, but their support isn't unconditional. Moscow wants a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, and Beijing wants Venezuelan oil. But both are pragmatic. If Maduro looks like a liability, they'll cut him loose. So he needs to show them that he's still relevant, still capable of projecting power, still worth their investment. That's why the NITSA's deployment was such a gift to him. It gave him an excuse to escalate. It allowed him to frame Venezuela as the victim of US aggression, even as he was the one making the threats. And it reinforced the narrative that he's standing up to the empire, which plays well with his base and with his allies in Moscow and Beijing. Now, let's talk about the opposition. Because this is where the real tragedy lies. The Venezuelan opposition has been trying to oust Maduro for years, but they've been outmaneuvered at every turn. The 2018 election was a farce, the 2020 parliamentary elections were boycotted, and the 2024 election is shaping up to be another sham. But here's the: Maduro doesn't need to win a fair election. He just needs to survive. And right now, he's doing just that. The opposition's biggest mistake has been assuming that economic pressure alone would force Maduro out. But sanctions have only made him more dependent on Russia and China, and they've given him an excuse to blame Venezuela's problems on the US. The Biden administration has tried to walk a fine line, keeping some sanctions in place while offering Maduro incentives to hold free elections. But Maduro has no intention of holding free elections. He's seen what happened in Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega rigged an election and got away with it. He's seen what happened in Cuba, where the regime has survived for decades despite US pressure. And he's betting that he can do the same. So what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. First, there's the status quo. Maduro keeps making threats, the US keeps sending ships, and nothing really changes. Guyana keeps pumping oil, Venezuela keeps suffering, and Maduro keeps blaming the US. This is the most likely outcome, at least in the short term. It's not ideal, but it's stable. And in geopolitics, stability is often the best you can hope for. Second, there's the escalation scenario. Maduro, emboldened by US reluctance, decides to make a move. Maybe it's a limited incursion into Essequibo. Maybe it's a blockade of Guyana's oil fields. Maybe it's something even more provocative, like seizing a US vessel. If that happens, the US will have to respond. But how? A naval blockade would be risky, it could escalate into a direct conflict. Airstrikes would be even riskier, they could trigger a regional crisis. And sending in troops? That's a non-starter. The American public has no appetite for another war, and the US military is already stretched thin. The third scenario is the most a miscalculation. Maybe Maduro thinks the US won't respond to a limited incursion. Maybe the US thinks Maduro is bluffing. Maybe a Venezuelan patrol boat fires on a Guyanese vessel, and things spiral out of control. That's the nightmare scenario, because it's the one that's hardest to predict. And in a region where tensions are already high, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Now, let's talk about the US response. Because here's where things get really frustrating. The Biden administration has been trying to thread the needle, keeping pressure on Maduro while avoiding a direct confrontation. But that's a losing strategy. Maduro doesn't respond to half measures. He responds to strength, and right now, the US isn't projecting strength. It's projecting indecision. The problem isn't just the NITS's deployment. It's the broader US approach to Latin America. The region has been an afterthought for years, and it shows. The US has no coherent strategy for dealing with Venezuela, no plan for countering Russian and Chinese influence, and no vision for the future of the hemisphere. And that's a problem, because Latin America is on the front lines of the new Cold War. Russia and China have been making inroads in the region for years. Russia has sold arms to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. China has invested billions in infrastructure projects, from ports and AMA to railways in Argentina. And both have been cultivating relationships with leftist governments, from Mexico to Argentina. The US has been slow to respond, and now it's paying the price. So what should the US do? First, it needs to stop telegraphing its reluctance. The NITS's deployment was a mistake, not because it was a bad idea, but because it was a half measure. If the US is going to deter Venezuela, it needs to do it with overwhelming force. That means sending a carrier strike group, not a single destroyer. It means working with allies like Brazil and Colombia to isolate Maduro. And it means making it clear that any aggression against Guyana will be met with a swift and decisive response. Second, the US needs to get serious about supporting the Venezuelan opposition. That means more than just rhetoric. It means providing them with the resources they need to challenge Maduro, both politically and militarily. It means working with regional allies to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. And it means being prepared to recognize a transitional government if Maduro falls. Third, the US needs to counter Russian and Chinese influence in the region. That means investing in Latin America, not just lecturing it. It means offering alternatives to Chinese loans and Russian arms. And it means working with allies to push back against authoritarianism in the hemisphere. But here's the: none of this is likely to happen. The US is too distracted, too divided, and too risk-averse to take the kind of bold action that's needed. And that's the real tragedy. Because Maduro isn't going anywhere. He's going to keep pushing, keep testing, keep probing for weaknesses. And unless the US changes its approach, he's going to keep winning. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has spent the last 3 decades treating Latin America as an afterthought, and now we're reaping what we've sown. The Maduro regime didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's the product of American neglect, Russian opportunism, and Chinese economic predation. And if we don't course correct soon, we're going to wake up one day to find that the Monroe Doctrine isn't just dead, it's been buried, exhumed, and repurposed as a Russian-Chinese condominium. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Guyana. Essequibo is the immediate flashpoint, yes, but the real prize is Venezuela's oil, specifically, the Orinoco Belt, which holds some of the largest proven reserves in the world. Maduro knows this. Putin knows this. She knows this. The only ones who seem to be in the dark are the policymakers in Washington, who still think this is a regional dispute that can be managed with sternly worded statements and the occasional sanctions package. Let me explain why this matters beyond the obvious. The Orinoco Belt isn't just oil, it's a geopolitical lever. Venezuela's production has collapsed under Maduro from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today, but the reserves are still there. And who controls those reserves controls the future of global energy markets. If Russia and China help Maduro stabilize production, even at half capacity, they gain a stranglehold over supply chains that could bypass US sanctions entirely. Imagine a world where Venezuelan oil flows to China via Russian-flagged tankers, while Europe and the US scramble for alternatives. That's the nightmare scenario, and we're sleepwalking toward it. So, what are the alternatives? The establishment narrative in Washington is that we have to choose between two bad: either we double down on sanctions and hope Maduro collapses under the weight of his own incompetence, or we engage in some half-hearted diplomacy and hope he'll play nice. Neither of these is a strategy. They're placeholders, the kind of thing you do when you don't actually want to solve the problem. Here's what a real strategy would look like. First, we need to recognize that Maduro isn't just a dictator, he's a proxy. Every time he tests the US, he's doing it with the backing of Moscow and Beijing. So the response can't just be about Venezuela, it has to be about the entire axis. That means targeting Russian and Chinese financial networks in the region, not just Venezuelan ones. It means exposing the corruption of Chinese infrastructure deals in Ecuador and Peru, where Beijing has been buying influence with debt trap diplomacy. And it means making it clear to regional allies that if they want US support, they can't keep playing both sides. Second, we need to stop pretending that sanctions alone will work. The US has sanctioned Venezuela for years, and all it's done is push Maduro closer to Russia and China. Sanctions are a tool, not a strategy. They have to be paired with something else, something that actually changes the calculus on the ground. That could mean covert support for the Venezuelan opposition, but it has to be done smartly. The last thing we need is another Bay of Pigs-style fiasco. It could mean working with Colombia and Brazil to create a regional security framework that isolates Venezuela militarily. Or it could mean offering Maduro a way out: amnesty, exile, whatever it takes to avoid a prolonged conflict. But here's the: none of this will happen unless the US stops thinking of Latin America as a backwater. The region is the front line of the new Cold War, and we're treating it like a sideshow. The Chinese are building ports and AMA and railways in Argentina. The Russians are selling arms to Nicaragua and Venezuela. And what are we doing? We're sending a single destroyer to Guyana and hoping for the best. Let me give you a historical parallel. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration understood that Central America was a battleground for Soviet influence. They didn't just send aid to the Contras, they worked with regional allies to isolate the Sandinistas. They didn't just sanction Cuba, they made it clear that any Soviet move in the hemisphere would be met with overwhelming force. That's the kind of clarity we need today. Not because we want another Cold War, but because we can't afford to lose this one. The problem is that the US foreign policy establishment is still stuck in the post-Cold War mindset. They think we can afford to ignore Latin America because the real threats are in the Middle East or Asia. But that's exactly what our adversaries want. They want us distracted, divided, and disengaged. And right now, they're getting exactly what they want. So where does that leave us? With a choice. We can keep pretending that this is someone else's problem, that Maduro will go away on his own, that China and Russia won't push further into our hemisphere. Or we can wake up and realize that the game has changed. The Monroe Doctrine isn't just a relic, it's a warning. And if we don't heed it, we're going to find ourselves in a world where the US is no longer the dominant power in its own backyard. The question isn't whether we can afford to act. It's whether we can afford not to,